Thank you, Professor Nikas. With an introduction like that, it can only go downhill. So I hope you won't mind it going downhill as it will happen. I'd like to thank very much Fedactio for inviting me to speak to you on a topic which I think is of fundamental and critical importance to the whole of Europe. It is not an issue of only immigrants and minorities. It's an issue for the whole of the continent. And at the European Union level, at a time in which the globalized neoliberal market has led to the collapse of many economies, for instance, of Greece, the Irish Republic, and Portugal, with deepening crises in Italy and Spain, this problem is manifest very openly for all of us. Masses of people in both public and private sector all over Europe are being made redundant, with dire consequences for the polities in the European continent in which they live. As the stock exchange improve their ratings, it is the citizens and the weak civil society which experiences pain. As my friend Professor George Markou in University of Athens in Greece says, it's an era of global dictatorship of the financial markets. With the disappearance of social solidarities, distress has now been created at planetary level, and cultural nationalism is not the answer, which is what is happening in many contexts in our continent. The question is how to organize a diverse civil society movement which allows people to cooperate with each other at national, regional, and international levels. Now, of course, this kind of cooperation is not an easy task, as Professor Sennett of the LSE has pointed out in his recent book, Together. This is necessary because human labor is being replaced by machine labor. The transnationals which govern our polities are not spatially grounded, but mobile entities which exploit local and global pools of labor. The response, for instance, of riots in England last summer was to build more prisons. Not that the riots themselves were a noble cause. They're based on consumerism, which is now rampant amongst the young people as well as the older people who have, of course, nurtured these consumerist tendencies amongst the young population. And communities have become fragmented and are empty shells and a lyrical illusion of what were integrated communities. Conservative and reactionary governments since the time of Reagan, Bush, and Thatcher have talked about the freeing the hand of government from the people and empower local communities. In fact, this has been a cynical manipulation and a manipulative device to give rein to the free market principle. Power has not been given back to the people or to the citizens who now have to confront the dire consequences in which there are no connectivities within and between communities. And that is a salient issue that we confront on how to use civil society initiatives to provide a social glue to empower citizens and their communities and to establish critical solidarities across group divides for democratic political action and engagement. And of course, the first step in restoring this trust is to establish dialogues, which can lay the foundation for cooperation and solidarities. This dialogical relationship takes time, effort, and it also needs skills of the kind that Fedactio can, I think, nurture in what I've seen since yesterday evening. The powers of cultural nationalism and rising particularist and religious forces on the European continent, or the fundamentalist Christians in the United States who argue for creationism, are averse to the necessity of establishing secular democratic values within our both continents. This is especially needed at a time when it might be more comfortable to retreat to the safe havens of glorious, secure, and mythical monocultural pasts which never existed, not even on the European continent, as I tried to point out yesterday. Europe has been multicultural from way past in its history. It's not the immigrants who make the European continent multicultural. The essence of intercultural understandings is in education and civil societies, and it's the basis of what we would establish as social interactions to provide skills and development of dialogues, as well as of creating policies and practices which enable these interactions to take place. Hence, the term multicultural, as again I pointed out, is being used as a descriptive term, not as a policy term, and I'll stress that later. Discussions about need for inclusion, interculturalism, and citizenship in the European continent are taking place at a time on which there is devolution on one hand and centralization on the other. So, for instance, in England, the power has been devolved in Parliament in London, but across Britain, let's say in Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales, there is an assembly in Cardiff for the Welsh, and a parliament, also an assembly in Northern Ireland, in Belfast, and a parliament in Edinburgh. So there's devolution on one hand, and centralization of powers at the European Union level. And these two are taking place at a time in which people and citizens have become disaffected with the political process, certainly in the way in which the politicians have dealt their hand. And we need to ensure that there is an integration of the ways in which people understand the continent. We need to understand the European continent not just in contemporaneous terms, but in historical terms. How are we where we are now because of the ways in which the continent has been diverse historically? In particular terms, issues of identity, whether it's singular or multiple forms, are relevant for intercultural relations and of citizenship. And these are necessary to deepen democracy and to ensure a critical appraisal of the kind of social solidarities within a socially diverse polity and the development of collaborative, of cooperative community participation to strengthen active citizenship. And this then presupposes that there are notions of belongingness, that people can feel that they belong, not that some belong and the others are there at the behest of those who belong. And this process needs to take place from preschool level right across to adult communities. But of course, the backdrop is that we live in communities which are xenophobic and racist. And here, Fedactio can play a very important role in establishing the kind of connectivities, not across the age group from preschool to the adult level, but also across communities, as I heard yesterday, to establish cooperative initiatives. In this paper, I'd like to use the term secular as not the way in which it is perceived in the common usage in the European context, as a separation between church and state, because it divides people into those who say we are religious and those who say, oh, they are secular. In the Indian context, the Prime Minister of India wanted to establish an Indian version of the term secularism. So here the term secularism meant that the constitutional framework of the country safeguards and protects the rights of people to believe and not to believe. The right of people to go to church, mosque, and temple, or not to go to church, mosque, and temple. So there's no difference in separation between the religious and the secular. It is just the fact that the secular is a constitutional device to protect the rights of people to believe and not to believe. However, the genus-based nature of the sacred, as well as that of the nation state, create problems for interfaith understandings. Here, what we need to look at is and ways in which we need to think about how can we develop European polities which, on the one hand, have a powerful moral secular ethic at the public domain level and genuine interfaith understanding in the private domain levels. And that is an Achilles heel for religions, particularly which are both transnational and multicultural. Both Dalai Lama and Hans Kung have said that there can be no world peace without peace amongst religions. There can be no peace between religions without dialogue between religions. So the whole thing about the dialogue comes back again to the fore. And this is not, of course, as I said earlier, helped by the corruption within the public domain and the assertion of short-term private gains which proceed over the long-term public interests that are necessary because they have corroded, as I said, the civil society, which is a lyrical illusion at the present time, as well as the basis of civic cultures and of the citizenship values which are so powerful. So democratic ethos in education is one fundamental importance. And here what I intend to suggest is not to teach young people about being citizens and active citizens, but the fact that they experience a democratic school within their kind of learning process, which makes them realize that active citizenship and democratic values are being dealt with by the adults as a way of them experiencing life. So here what I'm suggesting is that it's not just the young people who need to be part of the kind of active citizenship, but the adults. I'm sorry it's not so very clear, but there's a lot of good work being done by schools. But as soon as the children go home, the patriarchal or xenophobic or racist parents undo the work of the schools and the teachers that has been done. So here what we need is lifelong learning communities where adults also belong to the learning process and cannot really engage in undermining the work of the school. As I said earlier, the term multicultural is being used as a descriptive term to ensure that the term is not used as a bludgeon to hit people on the head with, like it's done in America and in other English-speaking countries, where multiculturalism is used as a policy term, and then, of course, the dominant elites say it is divisive of communities. And at this time, it said that the Enlightenment and Western values are being undermined by, for instance, the arrival of the others, and the others include the Muslim community in Europe. The tensions between the religious and the secular have been highlighted by Ian Baruma in his work, and also, for instance, Gilles Capel, who's written about Britain and the Netherlands, echoes that this kind of multiculturalism has echoes of the colonial practice of indirect rule organized by religious communities. So here, as I've stressed over and over again, the use of the term multicultural as a policy term negates the kind of issues that we are concerned with. And they ought to be structured as a way of intercultural understandings, not multicultural, using the term multicultural as a policy term. And further, in America, a man called Michaels, writing in 2007, said, it undermines the class divides. In other words, it obfuscates the real divides in our societies, which are based on social class. And of course, there's a recent work done by Kate Pickett and Richard Wilkerson, based on evidence-based research, which tends to suggest that inequalities and unequal societies are more unsafe than equal societies. So societies which are more equal, both the rich and the poor, are not only live a safe life, but have healthier life, and the societies are safer. And I think here what we need to again reconnect are issues of diversity with equality, issues of social inequalities, and the ways in which that undermines the ways in which different communities and diverse communities can live in peace with each other. There's also an argument to break away from the national container of history and to establish a transnational memory, not just a national, narrow, nationalistic memory. The normative cosmopolitanism of this level would create an institutional equality and an interdependence among groups. This suggestion by people like Beck and Grant is, of course, laudable and would therefore explore the kind of ways in which social interactions within and between groups and societies are obfuscated at the moment, and would enhance the notion of the ways in which people more can have identities which are across a national divide and enhance intercultural understandings. However, that too presupposes that we remove inequalities, social inequalities, and also more importantly, inequalities between men and women, which was suggested last night's session as well. Of course, there are also other groups who are invisible, and we don't tend to talk about them. And these are groups who are nomadic, who live amongst us. We as settled people, whether we are minorities or majorities, tend to look down on the people who are nomadic, the Roma, the Gypsy, and the traveler communities. Those ways of life are as legitimate as are our ways of life. And I think here we need to re-examine the kind of thinking on how to be part of integrated, diverse communities which accept values which may not necessarily be something that we adhere to. And that will necessitate the kind of dialogues which do not sort of presuppose a established basis which is static, but then, as Bakhtin says, a more dynamic dialogue, in which there is consensus, people can agree, and dissensus, where people don't agree. So that kind of way of dialogical development of dialogue, which helps us come across the deep divides and psychological structures which exclude people in our heads. The liberal market economies have deepened the divides between also the winners and the losers. But the elites continue to use the political rhetoric and the conventions of compromise, which disallows young people to engage with the substantive issues energetically and imaginatively, to establish new challenges on how to reintegrate our communities. And there are a lot of young people I've seen in the work I did with something called the Scarman Trust, where young people are more imaginative than the adults. The new communities, the asylum seekers and the immigrants, are more involved in community work than settled communities. And here we need to reshift the focus of our lenses or how we view people so that we can look at the informed, critical citizens from all aspects of the communities, both who are settled long-term and those who are new. So this paper is a bit long, so I'll have to cut a fair amount of it. And here I think what we also need to examine is the role of, for instance, how people understand their rights, responsibilities, and obligations. And it's not just education that plays a major role in this. The media has a major, is an area of major import. But very few people, adults and young people, read media messages critically. And here young people and adults themselves need to be well informed about how to read media messages critically, because a lot of the information comes from those sources. And that needs to be one of the kind of areas we need to focus on. And the elements of diversity which are reflected are also masquerading, for instance, hidden hatreds in our communities. So for instance, if you look at the islands where I come from, it's not the immigrants and the quote-unquote natives who are at loggerheads. It's, for instance, people who have lived with each other for a long time, the Northern Irish, the Catholics and the Protestants. So there are hidden hatreds of that kind which you need to unpick to then come to look at the ways in which contemporary hatreds are developed on top of them. And so here, in educational terms, there is a major role that the schools can play to bridge these divides between groups. At one level, this means that we have pedagogical challenges to deal with. And at the same time, we have institutional challenges. So what do I mean by that? If you have a school in which there is racism and sexism, that's an institutional challenge. And school policies and practices can deal with those kind of institutional challenges to ensure that there's no racism and sexism. There are pedagogical challenges, and that is the way in which, for instance, there are knowledges which are supposed to be legitimate and part of the civilized, and the knowledges which are excluded, mainly the knowledges of the minorities. And here, the suggestion I'd make is that we need to look at a non-centric curriculum. So if you look at a transnational memory or establishing transnational bases of knowledge, we can have a notion of knowledge which is not centered at any group, dominant or majority group, but cuts across group divides. So the pedagogical issues of curricula, which are not centric, are of paramount importance. And that then has fundamental basis for the ways in which democracies would work. so that we do not see communities just as having biological affinities, the ethnic basis of communities, but what is called by Bookchin as social affinities. So here what we need to look at are the ways in which we can establish confederal values which cut across community divides, group divides, specificities, ethnicities, and so on and so forth. And here there are ancient values of this continent, like the German value of Bildung or the Greek value of paideia. Can we look at those values of paideia and Bildung and make them into intercultural paideia and intercultural Bildung? And other civilizations, for instance, the Islamic civilization throughout the Renaissance till now has made a fundamental contribution to knowledge in Europe. How do we re-engage with that knowledge in the sciences and the medical arts and so on and so forth? And again, Fedactio's work here could be very, very important, both in terms of formal and non-formal education. And let's not forget the area of games and sports. In the playground, there is a lot of kind of sexism and racism amongst young people in the play. But when you have formal games where there are rules, then I think we could inculcate intercultural values for people who play games with fairness and ensure that that adds to the kind of academic learning which takes place in the classroom. The other issue which I like to stress is, for instance, not the fact that the formal structures in the state systems which discriminate, but the fact that certain groups in our societies and the patriarchal structures discriminate. The rights that girls and women have won in terms of work, study, and formal citizenship rights are a result of long, hard-fought struggles across the world. We as educators cannot afford to have these rights of girls and women being undermined in the 21st century. There needs to be a reappraisal of thinking about how patriarchal values are not allowed to corrode the rights of half the population of the world. The European society currently have an additional dilemma, as the old solidarities based on class and social class have been destroyed. And as I said, groups have been divided into winners and losers. And here I think it is Alison last night said at the session, as Putnam says, you cannot bowl alone. We have to bowl together. Now to bowl together, we have to establish the rules of how to bowl together. And here we need to again reconnect at all kinds of ways in both our communities and our institutional structures to build what Judith Green says in America, to develop communities of development and hope. Now, the last few points I'd like to make, I don't know how much time I have. A few minutes, okay. Well, is the fact that in many of our societies, difference and diversity are constituted as a notion of deficit. So, for instance, we have the IQ debate running across English-speaking countries, particularly in North America and Britain, where certain groups are designated as being intellectually deficient, and that is because they are different. And that is also a legacy in the communist countries of defectology, because the communists are trying to create equal people and thought certain people are eugenically not sufficiently good to be part of being equal communist societies. We need to deal this blow, need to deal this issue with the blow, which does not allow it to be surfaced in our public institutions. If you look at the ways in which, for instance, East European countries treat the Roma and the Gypsy and other minorities, is an indication of what I mean by this defectology. In the West, it is, as I said, the IQ debate. What we need to look at, for instance, are issues of multiple intelligences. People like Howard Gardner at Harvard University have done work which you know about. And we need to look at how we can use multiple intelligences to develop cooperative learning, where different intelligences amongst different young people can be built upon to develop strategies within a classroom, within a school, to ensure inclusive basis of learning of different intelligences with their linguistic, musical, artistic, mathematical, and so on and so forth, so that no young people are left out. And here what we also need to ensure are the kinds of structures which do not privilege one set of young people over other. But also this is informed by many people who've moved into Europe, because the assumption that immigrants only have an ethnic identity is rather superficial. I'll just give you an example of someone called Das, who runs the Asian Dub Foundation, who describes himself as Hindi, British Asian, English, Bengali, European. Okay, sort of a notion of multiple identity. And a person who called Pandit G, who runs the decks in that same band, who describes himself as half Irish, Asian Scot. Right. So here again, what we need to look at, where are the real hidden identities which cause hatreds? For instance, in the context of Belgium, where people who are causing the problems are not the immigrant communities, but the kind of indigenous sort of hatreds of groups towards each other. Linguistically, we're talking about languages being a positive thing, but here it's turned to a negative thing. And how do we turn that negative through hidden hatreds into a positive one? The last couple of points I should make through this long paper, which I said I've had to cut, is the fact that at a time of virtual factory where there are no jobs, we need to look at how are young people who are massively being unemployed going to be reintegrated into future societies. Civil society at the moment is not a strong enough entity. It's not sexy enough for young people. It doesn't have the kind of ways of bringing young people in, because what carries young people now are the gangs in our inner city areas. The gangs got rituals, they've got hierarchies, and they integrate people into an elaborate ritual system which have a much faster payoff through drugs and so on and so forth. Now, to turn that around requires a massive public effort. It is not just something that can be done willy-nilly with civil society on its own. It needs public, private, and civil societies to work together to establish a ways of which to reintegrate the kind of rather autonomous youth cultures which are not, do not comprehend the kind of adult values which they think have not incorporated them into the system at the moment. And that certainly is true, not just within the education system, but through the ways in which high levels of unemployment in certain communities has disaffected youth in our midst. Thank you.